During the pandemic lockdowns, I dealt with several mental health issues, at one point believing that I would benefit from professional care, even to the point of sacrificing my personal autonomy. This was not because of the pandemic, because I truly enjoyed the lockdowns and having my schedule on my own terms. The census during the lockdowns was a much better experience because I was not required to go to an office during that time, and I was able to assist my old position while earning income. However, the main issue that I was enduring was a lack of income at a job I had hoped to maintain until 2021. Instead of going to the IRS at the beginning of 2020, I was doing my best to remain loyal to a defunct position and avoid contracting COVID 19. When the lockdowns occurred, my roommate and I discussed how uncomfortable she felt with my outside work based on exposure and requested that I shower immediately every time I came home, which made sense as neither of us had respiratory therapist money. A therapist friend recommended YouTube videos, which I had already been watching, but I doubled down and made it my business to listen to soothing tones which validated my distress. However, it is hard to feel dopamine rushes if I cannot feel anything. During the George Floyd protests, a black college classmate decided to host a mental health group due to the barrage of racial issues that were front and center, as well as the fake support black people were getting, which largely included murals, conversations, and posting black squares on social medias. One of the members worked in racial advocacy, and at the time, the individual mentioned being completely done with racial advocacy. Back then, I wondered why, but I was also enduring low income, being in a racially hostile town with two police shootings near my home, and feeling increasingly disconnected to friend groups that were more about spending money and gossiping than emotional support. The group lasted for about 6 months, at which point I was more relaxed and stable, but I was beginning to understand why people were becoming fatigued with working in advocacy in the dominant narrative. In 2021, I was doing multiple contracts, but since people enjoy black people as entertainment rather than human beings, I was not receiving consistent livable income. A friend told me about an inside job to which I applied, but I never heard. Even though the census had taken 8 months to respond, I forgot how long it took to gain employment from the federal government, and I was trying to complete some contracts while also looking for income. By the time I considered going back to the IRS at the end of 2021, I was already in dire straits and I needed help from long-term friends to avoid becoming homeless. I had gone from gainfully employed to desperate in 2 years, and I was barely managing to hold on mentally while contracting. At the same time, there were no in-person hiring events at the IRS, and I had to wait until there was another one, which would not occur until March 2022. My roommate and I had decided to part ways, which was helpful for both of us because during the lockdowns, we had managed not to become completely hostile, but there was nothing left to sustain once I lost my income. Other friends gave me some emotional support, but there was very little to look forward to, and I explained this to another friend who happened to be a social worker. This individual had been very supportive to me during the lockdowns because they were in a higher financial status in a double income household, and their household took the racial justice conversations very seriously as Christians. I never would have gotten through the months of January through April 2022 without their help. At any rate, this friend suggested that I engage in subsidized mental health, and I was interested in seeing if there was therapy available so I could process all the situations I dealt with, including the dissolution of a lot of unhealthy relationships. Subsidized care is nothing like the therapy I had participated in during college and after the end of a long-term relationship and familial discord. There are several more people, and the process is incredibly underfunded and therefore understaffed. I no longer wonder why there are so many unhoused people who were never able to process their issues and attain emotional equilibrium. Without a car, it was very difficult to get to the appointments, especially while moving twice, since the facilities were in East Austin. During the onboarding appointment, I made a point of being vulnerable and discussing how I had come to the conclusion that I needed therapy beyond YouTube, and the staff was very understanding and gave me my first appointment towards the middle of April. It was also then that my mother passed away, and in addition to moving excessively, waiting for my job to begin, and having little income, I had to process that loss as well. The second I walked into the appointment, I was asked about my weight and blood work was done, which was odd to me since I had attended therapy multiple times in the past. I had gone without health insurance for so long that I had forgotten that people needed blood work for medication, so I was still patiently waiting for an onboarding therapy session, hoping that I would get reasonable appointments. As I was waiting, a physician's assistant walked in and proceeded to ask me if I was allergic to medication and what kind of medication I would be most comfortable with taking. I explained that I was there to receive mental health care, to which they responded, "Well, that would be another appointment, so let's get you set up with the medication while we're here." I responded, "Is this designed to keep me productive and consumptive?" The facial expression was priceless, and the physician's assistant said nothing. "Thank you, but I'm looking for therapy, not medication, so perhaps someone else will find this helpful." Side note, I have taken medication in the past, but recognize that pills do not change circumstances. The next week, I was scheduled for an onboarding therapy session, and while I was there, I noticed that there were several people there as well, but there were a lot more apprentices being supervised than standalone practitioners. My onboarding session went relatively well, only because I had received notification that I would be starting my job at the IRS soon. I was comfortably housed in a temporary housing situation, and I had received information about long-term housing that would be available right as my short-term lease was over. After the session, I was directed to a number of different services, but the payment was at least $50 a session, and I was barely making ends meet while waiting for the job to start. I realized that I would not be able to maintain any kind of therapy until I was able to afford more money per session, and that I would need to potentially have insurance. People should notice two things about gaining mental health for people who are actively struggling and who lack the opportunities required to sustain themselves. First, rather than providing anything, most people will try to give someone medication so that we can continue with our lives of drudgery, because those with wealth and privilege will do anything but accept the responsibility of filling lives with stress and dissatisfaction. Second, the poor are considered the easiest people to observe, as if it is more important to observe how to make us tolerate more torture than to genuinely relieve the circumstances, especially since the wealthy have no intention of sharing. While it may seem fun to stare at unhoused people talking to themselves in the streets, consider that most of them have mental health concerns that they can neither afford nor assuage. Towards the end of April, there was a potential paid fellowship that reviewed racial stress for people who had been working in racial justice and allowed folks to have discussion groups and journal. This was right up my alley since I had spent 18 months going through a variety of different fellowships designed to engage race on different issues within the built environment. The pay was only $1,500 for an entire year, but I figured that if people started listening to the toll that racial activism takes on people, more people would start doing things to actually address the issues being presented. I told other people, including a new roommate who was also a colleague, and we both were hoping to hear good news about the project. I kept checking to see what happened to the program, and suddenly the organization sent an email out explaining that it was reorganizing leadership and everyone would know more about the program soon. Months afterwards, we learned that the program was shut down and nobody ever heard about it again, proving that even the notion of mental health was unworthy of discussion within the dominant narrative. I have never heard of any other program that has ever considered the toll of offering solutions and explanations can take, especially when people lie and tell you that they want to address problems but refuse to do so. For racial justice, people are too focused on external exploration rather than self-examination, as well as critiquing the behavior of targets of oppression and marginalization. Consequently, the stigma of mental health is also anti-blackness because it fails to acknowledge how black people were used as emotional labor in situations we could not escape. White people who cry and trauma dump during racial discussions are revealing their bigotry. This proves that people believe that it is worthless to respect the emotional abuse of working with those who never see any point in changing and put the onus on the world around them. I would later lose a job in another country by merely suggesting that people are responsible for their feelings and behavior. Because of the emotional and financial trauma I endured while moving 4 times and waiting for full time employment to subsidize my living expenses, a colleague recommended free mental health services with the SAFE Alliance, and I was finally able to get therapy in November 2022. Mind, this was 2 years after I originally sought therapy, and I had been in advocacy for years under different umbrellas. Simultaneously, consider all the conversations I had endured where I was required to walk on eggshells and make space for everyone's feelings while nobody was required to consider mine. I recognize my good fortune in not succumbing to complete emotional shutdown during this time, and this is why I am sharing my experience. My personal life had changed significantly, and I was worried about reverting to destructive patterns based on betrayal trauma, so thankfully I was able to get the help I needed. Having the money to afford my life, being in a safe living circumstance, and coming to the end of the advocacy programs was critical to ending the stress and emotional turmoil in my mind. There was one moment when a neighbor maintained a pack of vicious dogs who bit everybody, and a roommate who actively goaded the dogs to harm others, and the stress level rose again throughout the house. My therapist asked me if I was looking to relocate since my home had become unsafe, and I remarked that I was in the process of searching, but that I needed to be close to my full-time work. I had also finished the majority of my contracts, so I was literally down to one job which paid my bills and allowed breathing room, all of which made my life much easier. Amidst all this unrelenting harassment and surveillance, there is a constant command to be nice. Imagine being work sick, displaced, constantly ridiculed, and financially destroyed, and then being told to be nice by the ones who made it happen. Too many white people like to threaten BIPOC advocates with the idea of burning bridges, as if it should be impossible to hurt our feelings or emotional health in any way. This is a carryover ideology that we feel less pain because we are so resilient. Additionally, so many people look at BIPOC individuals as if we are supposed to acquiesce to whatever they say. I guess since so many people were raised in segregation, it never occurred to them that they have the right to speak their mind, but not the right to control a response. Demanding that we fund racism while we wait on the dominant narrative to shape up is financially abusive. It is not uncomfortable to be paranoid as a black femme. It is uncomfortable to have said paranoia substantiated. The most devastating aspect of structured anti-racism work is the repression of emotions due to being at the mercy of white feelings. Even as assertive as I was, there was so much reframing and rewording due to the knowledge that most of my colleagues were looking to brand me as crazy, angry, and my personal favorite, ignorant about the process. Enabling behavior is less about accommodation and more about control, essentially stating, since I am not allowed to be uncomfortable in this space, you have to remain uncomfortable just like me to prove how committed you are to the cause. For any future racial justice work, people will need to maintain therapists on standby because willfully incompetent people cannot solve problems they refuse to face, nor should they coerce others to help them. Too often, the success of advocacy commands that we want the same things within the dominant narrative. Anyone who wants something different is seen as trash. Moreover, if people want black people to work in racial justice with people who want to pretend that racism is all in our minds and get defensive when any real circumstances arise, they need to pay a lot more, or accept that they enjoy psychologically abusing black people in front of other white people for kicks. The federal funding, by its own admission, was centered around conversations and feelings, even though people have been enduring more than that and have been forced to recover on a regular basis. Black people will need a lot more than social capital before we are willing to endure anything else resembling racial justice work that involves manipulating us without any material gains.